Picture this: a tiny baby tucked away into a woven basket, set adrift on the swirling waters of the Nile River. Under the shadow of Pharaoh's ruthless decree, a desperate mother places her infant son in that basket, entrusting him to God's mercy. Around him, danger looms. Decrees of death, a nation enslaved, yet this child is marked by divine protection, destined to rise as a deliverer. Little does she know, this act of faith will set in motion a chain of events that will not only free a nation, but also echo through the ages, pointing to a greater salvation yet to come. This is the story of the birth of Moses, a story where desperation meets destiny. In this lesson, we'll uncover how this fragile beginning launches Israel's journey from oppression to freedom and whispers of another Savior to come. From the perilous waves of the Nile to the shadow of the cross, themes of destruction and salvation intertwine. Curious to see how it all connects? Let's pull on this thread together and unravel the story of the birth of Moses. Our previous lesson in our series called Biblical History was an introduction to the book of Exodus. We looked at how that first chapter really functions as this bridge for us to come from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus. We saw how the Israelites got into Egypt. We hear the story of their slavery so often and the story of their escape, but sometimes it's not at all clear how they got into such a mess to begin with. Well, it was because Joseph, he was a really good guy. And those brothers that tried to kill him, they were forgiven when he rose to power in Egypt. They came to Egypt to seek refuge from famine, Jacob and all of his sons, with the exception of Joseph, because obviously he's in Egypt. And Joseph was there. He turned the other cheek. He blessed those brothers that persecuted him or tried to curse him, and brought prosperity to a foreign people. And this very much foreshadows the work of Christ, who forgives his fellow Israelites as he is lifted up on a cross. And it's a beautiful story, and we'll continue to see so many parallels with Christ as we look into the story of Moses. I mentioned the other week that the book of Matthew and Exodus work beautifully with one another, and that's intentional. So if we look at the main characters that transition us from Genesis to Exodus, we start with Jacob, who has a son named Joseph, right? This is what we see in Genesis. It's the patriarchs transferring to Joseph. Joseph becomes this main character of the Genesis story. And what he's known for best is he has these dreams of salvation, of saving his brothers, of saving the people of Israel. And Joseph, he has this dream and it comes true. And he plays a pivotal role in preserving his family during this time of famine. And they come to Egypt, and we went over that whole story. And you've got to ask, well, then who's the next main character? And we've come upon it in the book of Exodus. It introduces us to the character of Moses. So the main character line goes Jacob, Joseph, then Moses. Those are the main characters in the story. And Moses is the one who delivers God's people out of Egypt. Now, interestingly enough, there's a similar thing happening in the book of Matthew, right? When we look at the genealogy of Jesus, specifically the patriarchal genealogy, Jesus' legal father, according to Jewish law, was Joseph. And who was Joseph's father, according to the book of Matthew? Well, in Matthew's account, Joseph's father is Jacob. Yes, the same name as the patriarch of Genesis. You see, this Jacob, Joseph, Jesus sequence echoes that Old Testament narrative, where Jacob and Joseph set the stage for Moses, the great deliverer. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Both Josephs are tied to dreams that shape their stories, right? In Genesis, Joseph's dreams, they foretell of his rise to power and his role in saving his family. In Matthew, Joseph, the husband of Mary, gets a dream straight from God, first to flee Egypt to protect baby Jesus from Herod, and later to return after Herod's death. So both Josephs, they're dreamers, and their dreams are the key to God's salvation of his people, salvation for his people. Now, you might be wondering, hold on, that's just Matthew's account. What does Luke say? What is the genealogy? And you'll notice that Luke's genealogy is actually very different, which is where we can get this specific differentiating of genealogies and figure out that Matthew is really intentionally trying to parallel the book of Exodus. Luke's genealogy is different, right? In Luke, Joseph's father is named Heli, not Jacob. So why the difference? Well, scholars, they have a bunch of theories, but here's the thing, right? Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, and he's Jewish himself. He thinks like a Jew. And he seems to be intentionally tying Jesus to Israel's history. By calling Joseph's father Jacob, he's nudging us to see Jesus as a Moses figure. He's nudging the Jewish audience that he's writing to see him as the Moses figure, connecting that Exodus story to what's happening in the gospel. Luke, on the other hand, might be giving us a more biological line or highlighting the different angles of Jesus's ancestry. Now, there may be a tendency in us to say, there's this contradiction, and that anxiety can be seized by both legalistic Christians and vitriolic skeptics alike. But the truth is that it's not a contradiction, it's a nuance, right? Instead of seeing these details as things that either bolster or challenge our presuppositions, we should accept them and ask, why is it different here? And when we ask why, we see that Matthew crafts this genealogy and this story to echo the Old Testament intentionally. He does this on purpose. Take his genealogy, right? He organizes it into 3 sets of 14 generations. You've got Abraham to David, David to the Babylonian exile, and then the exile to Jesus. And this isn't just like a random list. It's deliberate. In Jewish thinking, numbers like 14, which is what we learn is linked to David's name because the intention of that genealogy is to link him to the Davidic lineage. This number 14 carries this deep theological weight. Matthew even skips some generations to fit this pattern, showing that he's less concerned with this empirical accuracy and more focused on what these time periods reveal, which is God's covenant with Abraham, the rise of the Davidic kingdom, and this fall into exile, and finally, with where he's concluding today with Jesus, the arrival of the Messiah. He's thinking like a Jew, where narrative and symbolism outweigh this strict factual tally. Luke, on the other hand, doesn't lean into this kind of symbolic structure. He traces Jesus' line all the way back to Adam without those neat groupings of 14. And he's suggesting this broader, more universal perspective, likely because he's writing to Gentiles who don't share this same Jewish epistemology, the same way of thinking. Luke's approach isn't less Jewish necessarily, but it's less tied to the specific theological rhythms that Matthew is emphasizing. So, when you look at Matthew's 3 sets of 14, it's not about being historically perfect. That's not what he's aiming at. It's about showing how Jesus fulfills and transcends Israel's story. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, Russell, you're looking at it too deeply. You're grasping at straws here. This Exodus Matthew parallel, it's just a slight coincidence. I think I would disagree, right? So look at it, right? Tell me, who's spared from a tyrant's mass infanticide of Jewish boys? Both of them. Who comes out of Egypt to save God's people? Well, in the book of Matthew, it's specifically mentioned that Jesus goes down to Egypt and then he comes out. It's fulfilling prophecy. But Moses does the same thing, so both of them. Who gets divine revelation on top of a mountain and then preaches a new covenant to the people of Israel? Oh, both of them. Who faces a wilderness test? Both of them. One for 40 years and the other for 40 days. Who feeds a hungry crowd with miraculous multiplying of bread? You guessed it. Both of them. Who brings salvation and transformation to his people through water? Oh, both of them. One with the Red Sea crossing and the other with the teaching of baptism, which is intentionally parallel to the Red Sea crossing in the New Testament. Oh, who's tied to the sacrifice that beats death? Both of them, right? The Passover lamb for Moses, and then Jesus, who is the fullest representation of the spiritual Passover lamb. And who gets taken up before God, or who gets taken up by God before they can physically witness the fruition of their mission. Both, right? And that's not even all of the parallels that we're going to make. And you could say, well, that's just a coincidence. And maybe it's all just a pure coincidence. Maybe I'm wrong. But I really think that there's intentionality on Matthew's part. And the connections, they're all over the place. There's even more than the few that I just mentioned. But for now, we find ourselves looking at the birth of Moses, right? The second half of Exodus 1, where Pharaoh commands the Hebrew midwives to kill all the baby boys. This is where we find ourselves in the story of Moses as we're jumping in. Pharaoh, he thinks the Israelite people are populating too much. They're too blessed. So he's got to figure out something to do. And so he commands these Hebrew midwives to kill all of the little boy children, something that also happens in the story of Jesus, except under Herod. And in this story, in the second half of Exodus 1, the assumption is that Pharaoh was trying to do this kind of under the radar, so to speak. He wanted the midwives to have all of the baby boys accidentally die and make it look like it wasn't done intentionally. And this is where he runs into a problem, right? The midwives are not doing as he asked because the midwives are Jewish. They're not going to secretly kill all the baby boys in their community. So controversially, the Hebrew midwives lie to the Pharaoh, saying that the women, they're just giving birth so quickly that they can't get there in time to kill them. And as a result, God blesses those women for lying and gives them children of their own. And this is because the position of a midwife was something that was traditionally given to women who couldn't have kids. Okay. Pharaoh has tried to keep all this under wraps because the Israelite people are numerous and he doesn't want an uprising, but eventually he just gets sick of it. The last verse of the first chapter of Exodus reads, it says, Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, all sons that are born must be thrown into the river, but all daughters you may let live. Now, this is the world that Moses is born into. All of the baby boys have to die, but all of the daughters can live. And what's really important is that births, infancy, childhood, they're all very important to the biblical stories. Major figures like the patriarchs, the judges, the kings, the prophets, all have miraculous births, infancies, childhoods. And this is a supernatural indication of God's stamp of approval on them. God has marked them for something special. Now, Moses isn't born of a barren or a virgin mother. He's not the least likely son among other sons like we've read in the past in Genesis, like we see with all those other stories. No. We see this beautifully unique story, and it starts out really in Exodus chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 1. And we're going to go all the way to verse 10. And I'm going to probably stop along the way, much to your irritation. But there's a couple of really important things. Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 1, says, A man from the household of Levi married a woman who was a descendant of Levi. We'll pause there. I have this really bad habit of just stopping after a couple of words. Don't get irritated at me. But this is good context that I want to point out. The household of Levi is the priestly tribe. We learned about that in the last couple lessons. They are intended to be mediators for God and his people. Moses very much embodies this, as he will later be the one and only man that can talk with Yahweh mouth to mouth. That's the literal translation. We would say something like face to face. He can talk with God face to face. Moses, the deliverer, is very much not painted as this military conqueror, but he is a humble, a spiritual liberator, very similar to Jesus. Anyways, it continues on by saying, gave birth to the son. When she saw that he was a healthy child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she was no longer able to hide him, she took a papyrus basket for him and sealed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and set it among the reeds along the edge of the Nile. His sister stationed herself at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Okay, this sister, obviously Moses' older sister, plays a role later on in the larger story, and you might know her name. This is Miriam. Anyway, that's kind of just like more context. Verse 5. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself by the Nile, while her attendants were walking alongside the river, and she saw the basket among the leaves. She sent one of her attendants, took it, opened it, and she saw the child, a boy crying, and she felt compassion for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Okay, she undoubtedly knows what's going on. She knows the commission, but she has compassion on this child who is Moses. And I'm gonna pause here for a moment in order to be a little bit more indulgent in something that I find interesting, and maybe and hopefully you will too. The floating of baby Moses down the Nile River to Pharaoh's daughter actually tells us the Israelites and the Egyptians, or tells us the Israelites and the Egyptians, specifically the royalty, they lived fairly close to one another. They lived in a close proximity along the delta, likely during what historians would classify as the new age of the Egyptian empire, or they would say it's the new kingdom of Egypt, because it's had various life cycles in it, yes, including the one that's there now. The royal activity in the delta, especially under Ramses II, supports a 13th century BCE setting. This era's historical context, right, Egypt's power and the Israelites' enslavement, further fits the broader Exodus narrative. So it really bolsters kind of the biblical validity of the timeline. So this scene kind of informs us that the time period was likely the New Kingdom around the 13th century BCE, when Egypt's rulers were in the Delta. Previously, they might have switched places and they might have switched kingdoms, but we know that it's in the Delta, according to what we're reading with the baby Moses flowing north. So it was also nearer to the Israelites, making Moses' remarkable journey, both geographically and historically, plausible. It's really cool. It's just really cool that, I keep saying really cool because I think it's really cool. But such a small detail as Moses floating northward, because the Nile is the only major river on earth that flows north, is something that can validate this modern conception of historicity in the story. Again, I just think that's really cool. Maybe I just bored you to death. But, that's totally okay. Anyways, verse 7. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nursing woman for you from the Hebrews, so that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes, do so." So the young girl went and got the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. This is another miraculous element of the story. It's a detail to really show God's favor. Through this highly unlikely chain of events, this boy is returned to his mother unharmed, spared from death, but now the mother is getting paid directly by Pharaoh's bank account to raise and care for her child. And this very much echoes the same principle of when Abraham was willing to give up his son, Isaac. God returned him and added blessings on top of that. But it also foreshadows Mary, the mother of Jesus, giving up her son to death only for him to be brought back to her, brought back to life. Anyways, verse 10, it says, "When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" Okay, we're going to stop at verse 10 there. Now, this is really the last statement before the story really gets into the adult life of Moses in verse 11 of this second chapter. But it's saturated with meaning, these first couple of verses, but also the name of Moses itself. Moses means to draw out, and we're given the reasoning of Pharaoh's daughter, that she drew him out of the Nile River. But the name, on a different level, is foreshadowing the role that Moses will play in drawing God's people out of Egypt, the Israelites out of Egypt. And he's the one that is doing the drawing. That's his whole ministry. Everything that he is doing from the very moment that he's found in the Nile River is to draw people out, specifically the Jewish people that are held in captivity in Egypt. Now, the image of what is also directly tied to Moses the image of what is also directly tied to Moses as well. Remember from our lesson on Noah, water and specifically rivers in the ancient Near East have a twofold purpose. They destroy what is unnatural, what shouldn't be there, and they bring nutrients and new life to the soil. And this is the twofold purpose of this water or this river. And this is a type of baptism, right? The washing away of sin or of what is unnatural, and the bringing of life, or the bringing of the Spirit, the bringing of nutrients into our lives. It is the Nile River that was intended to be the destruction of all the male infants of Israel, right? They were commanded to throw them all in the river. It was an intentional infanticide. But the opposite happens, though, right? The same river that was intended to destroy the people of God is the one that actually brings them deliverance and, in turn, destruction to Egypt. And this is the deep symbolism that rests at the story of the birth of Moses, a pattern that we will see repeated at the Red Sea, which blocks the Israelite people from escaping the Egyptian pursuers. But then that same water, which was intended to represent their destruction by the Egyptian pursuers, turns into their salvation. But not only that, it's the destruction of the army of Pharaoh. Moses, then, is both the bringer of destruction and the bringer of salvation. And Jesus said, right, what did he say? That he would destroy this temple. Yes, he's bringing destruction, but that in 3 days he would raise it up. And he would say he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And yet he's called the Prince of Peace, and he does bring peace. And both of these individuals act as a flood, right? They are the waters. They are the men who are the divine instruments of God's purpose. Jesus being more than just a shadow, more than just a story, but the explicit manifestation of that divine purpose that we see hinted at in these Exodus stories, specifically in this story of Moses. He was the final sacrifice, done once and for all. So as we read about Moses, as we go through some of the most profound and ancient stories that humanity has to offer, let us not forget this immense privilege that we have standing on this side of the cross. We see God's thread of purpose, his logos, his word manifest. That is largely why the book of Exodus means so much to us. Exodus isn't just a biblical history, it's a blueprint for transformation. It's our story. It's the story that God is using to guide us along this path of stepping out from Egypt, from a lifestyle of sin and selfishness, and into a wilderness, a place where we have to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. We have to learn who God is, what he wants from us. We are wanderers while we are here on this earth until the time that we get to meet with God. We have to learn how to commune with him. But also, we have faith of that promise that is to come, that promised land. That's the story of the gospel, really. The good news of a home that lies beyond this land that we have to wander in, that we are foreigners in. If only we would put our trust in Christ. Not some man that's here on earth today, not some personality, not an idea, not a congregation, not a doctrine, not a political ideology, but a radical trust and faith in the work of Jesus.